There are obvious differences in reproductive anatomy and physiology between the sexes, but other differences seem to be less tied to reproduction. In humans, what are referred to as sex differences are usually gender differences, whether someone appears or identifies with being male or female, rather than an assessment of chromosomes or hormones. However, the two terms are often conflated, so be mindful when considering research findings. The basis of sex or gender categories should be outlined in the article's methods section. We'll look at some behavioral sex and gender differences in humans and other primates. Outside of a reproductive context, why study sex differences? There are some important clinical implications, such as differences in the prevalence or manifestation of certain diseases and responses to drugs. Most preclinical biomedical research is often done using only male animals, so using these as models for human disease should include females as well. In addition to these implications for humans, there are good reasons to study sex differences in wild animals. Endocrine disruptors, like bisphenol A, or BPA as it's commonly known, can result in earlier puberty and reduced fertility, and can bias the sex ratio in an exposed population. This can have dire consequences for endangered species, with already low numbers of fertile adults. Let's look at some sex differences early in life. One of the most reported behavioral sex differences early in life is the types of play male and female children prefer. Girls tend to prefer dolls and role-playing, and boys prefer trucks and balls. These differences are observed cross-culturally, so one interpretation of this finding is that play bias has a biological basis. Some supporting evidence comes from our primate relatives. Social and cultural factors should have less of an influence on these vervet monkeys, yet they show the same sex-based toy preferences. Another way to explore sex differences in play is to look at very young children, before they've had a lot of exposure to the culture they'll grow up in. Let's look at some of the research. Mothers who had an amniocentesis as part of their pregnancy care were recruited for this study, so researchers had samples of amniotic fluid to measure prenatal hormone levels. After the children were born, they were tested at 13 months in a structured play test with 9 previously rated toys. Feminine toys were a teapot and a cup, a doll in a cradle, and an older doll with a brush and mirror. Masculine toys included a trailer with 4 cars, a garbage truck, and plastic construction equipment. Neutral toys were a plastic dog, a wooden puzzle, and a stacking pole with rings. Toy type is shown along the x-axis on the bottom, and percentage of time spent with each type of toy over a 7-minute session is shown on the y-axis on the left. Indeed, girls, shown by the white bars, on average, spent more time playing with feminine toys than boys, shown in black. The opposite pattern was observed with boys, and there was no difference in time spent with neutral toys. Although these gender differences are statistically significant, a quick comparison within the genders shows that this difference is quite small. Boys, on average, spent about 30% of their time with quote-unquote feminine toys, and roughly 41% of their time with quote-unquote masculine toys. The difference for girls was larger, but clearly both genders like to play with both sorts of toys. Because the researchers had samples of amniotic fluid, they were able to look at correlations between prenatal hormones and play behavior in these kids after they were born. Although early life testosterone is reported to have a masculinizing effect on play, the only significant correlation was between prenatal progesterone and masculine play in boys. With a correlation coefficient of 0.3, this is not a strong association, and there were no other significant links between any prenatal hormones and play. There were, however, a number of non-hormonal factors linked to gender-related play. For example, parental education was positively associated with masculine play and negatively associated with feminine play, but only in boys. This study looked at toy preferences in 3-month-olds who, because of their young age, were exposed to less cultural influence than the 13-month-olds in the previous study. Because these children have not yet developed the motor skills to manually play with toys, researchers assessed preference for dolls or trucks by visual fixation time, a fancy term for how long they looked at something. The average number of fixations is shown on the y-axis on the left. There is a gender difference of sorts, but it's driven by the girl's biased preference for the doll. The boys in the study did not show any preference at all. There are also studies that find bigger sex differences, usually with older children. One study looked at gender-related toy preferences and compared this to children with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. They're exposed to high levels of androgen prenatally. Both boys and girls with CAH showed masculine toy preferences in this study. These studies bring up an important point when considering sex or gender differences, in that some well-accepted differences are in fact quite small. A statistically significant difference in a laboratory study does not indicate the size of this difference. For most behaviors, there is a lot of overlap, as shown here. This hypothetical figure displays this phenomenon. An average difference between males and females does not indicate the degree of spread and overlap. It's common for a difference within the sexes to be larger than differences between. For non-reproductive processes and behaviors, the differences between sexes or genders are swimming in a sea of similarities. Let's consider some sex differences in adults and have a close look at the data. There are some documented differences in cognition, with females performing better on tests of perceptual speed, fine motor tasks, and math calculation. Males, on the other hand, are more accurate than females in target-directed motor skills, mathematical reasoning, and spatial tasks. But how big are these differences? Let's have a look at some data. This study should give us an idea of sex differences in cognition. They used a neuropsychological test battery with a decent N. The tests that make up this battery are indicated on the x-axis on the bottom. From left to right, they are abstraction and mental flexibility, attention, verbal memory, spatial memory, language reasoning, spatial processing, sensory function, and motor speed. Males are shown in blue and females in red, and the y-axis is the Z-score, or the number of standard deviations from the mean. This ranges from +3 to -3. In this figure, anything above the line is greater than the mean, and below means lower than the mean. At first glance, it appears that males do much better on motor skills, and females do better on verbal memory. But if you consider the y-axis, these are not huge differences. Be careful in interpreting the results of studies showing performance differences between men and women. Expectations about gender differences can have meaningful effects on performance. This study recruited psych students with a B in first-year math and administered a math test, mostly calculus and some algebra, either an easy or difficult version. The y-axis on the left shows the score on the test. Men are shown in black and women in white. There's no difference between groups on the easy version, and although both did worse on the difficult test, women underperformed in comparison to men. This is not the first report of this difficulty by gender effect, but these authors suggested the reason for this difference could be stereotype threat, whereby an individual conforms to stereotypes about their group. Loads of prejudice research shows that the stereotype of men being better than women at math and science is commonly held, so the authors did a second experiment to explore this hypothesis. In Experiment 2, a similar group of participants were given the difficult test used in Experiment 1, but they were given different information before starting. Half were told that for this specific math test, there's no gender difference in performance, while the other half were told that men typically do better on this test. It's clear from the bars on the right that expecting a gender difference actually produced one, and this can be eliminated by challenging this stereotype, as shown in the no gender difference condition. This study highlights that non-endocrine factors can produce gender differences. So we should always be cautious in assuming that gender differences are due to hormones. Another commonly held belief, often reported in the scientific literature, is the idea that men and women value different aspects of love. Evolutionary psychologist David Buss reasons that reproductive success, in other words, having the most offspring survive, involves different strategies for females and males. The idea is that for our ancestors, females typically raised young, and this produced different challenges than males, so they were choosy and mated carefully. Males were most reproductively successful if they mated often. According to this theory, these tendencies have persisted to modern day, so we should be able to easily demonstrate these differences in modern humans by asking them their views about relationships. This study by Beverly Fair at the University of Winnipeg had participants rate aspects of love and commitment by simply asking them to rate the relevance of each attribute to their central concept of love, higher values meaning more important. Features related to honesty, loyalty, and support were rated highest, and those associated with passion and desire were rated as least important. There was no difference whatsoever based on gender. In another study by Fair, men and women completed the Views of Love scale, which consists of 15 different types of love derived from lay people's descriptions. They're shown on the bottom. Average ratings are shown on the y-axis on the left, men shown in white circles and women in black circles. The types rated the highest for both men and women were nurturing types of love, like friendship and family. The lowest ratings were for non-nurturant types, like passionate and sexual love. The authors highlight statistically significant differences between genders on the types indicated with stars, and they concluded that women value friendship and sisterly love more, and men value aspects of romantic or passionate love more. The title of this article is Gender and Personality Differences in Conceptions of Love, an Interpersonal Theory Analysis. Although the statistics identified a statistically significant difference for these different types of love, the authors make no mention of the effect size or even just the magnitude of these differences. To me, these lines are almost overlapping, so pointing out the tiny differences seems to miss the larger picture. What these findings show is that sex differences in humans are typically small in magnitude and usually based upon gender rather than a determination of sex.